Hello and welcome back to the Experts of the Americas series, where we bring together regional and global experts to unpack the trends shaping the future of the Western Hemisphere. Today, we continue our series exploring Latin America and the Caribbean's evolving relationship with China and what it means for U.S.-Latin America relations.
Over the past decade, China has become a major investor, lender, and technology partner for many countries across the region. But beyond trade and financing, these relationships have implications for security, infrastructure, supply chains, and broader geopolitical alignment.
Now, to help us unpack these strategic dimensions, we are joined by Dr. Brian Fonseca, an expert on hemispheric security, U.S.-China competition, and Latin America's rapidly shifting foreign policy. He's currently the director of the Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, a champion institution producing thoughtful work on some of the hemisphere's most timely social and security issues. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Stephanie, for having me.
Now, to start off with the big picture, the recently published U.S. National Security Strategy highlights increasing concern about malign Chinese activities in Latin America and the Caribbean. In a previous episode, one of our experts argued that many Latin American governments have turned to China because they perceived the U.S. approach as overly ideological, pushing them to align politically rather than economically. Now, as Washington recalibrates its engagement, what approach can the U.S. take to strengthen its regional presence without forcing countries to choose between the U.S. and China?
That's a great question. I'll say that I'll start off by saying I think that there is some truth to countries, looking for alternatives to the United States, on the sort of basis of ideological preferences and sort of U.S. pursuit to advance its policy interests. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate across the hemisphere. I think the hemisphere, in many ways, in a very pragmatic way, have been looking for alternatives to the United States. They've been looking for options and opportunities to continue to advance their respective interests in the absence of the United States in some cases. It's long been argued that countries like China have made tremendous inroads in Latin America, largely because the United States has not put a tremendous emphasis on this hemisphere in its foreign policy and national security priority list. China outspends the United States 15-1 historically. That's slowed over the last few years, certainly post-pandemic, but the Chinese have just had a lot more capital and sort of funding to pour into the region. And that's been very enticing for Latin American governments that, in sort of the context of democracy, need to deliver for its constituencies and are desperate for resources to do that. That said, the U.S. has historically, and certainly more recently, made it an emphasis to, almost demand Latin American countries choose between the United States and China, because the United States has articulated China as the most consequential threat to American national interests in the 21st century. And so the new national security strategy, Miguel, as you pointed out, focuses fundamentally, I think, on two things. One, China as the threat to American national interest, and two, the Western Hemisphere as a premier battleground in which the United States needs to continue to double down on, not just to outcompete China, but for a range of other issues that are consequential to the American homeland. Now, this issue of sort of framing between the United States and China has been challenging because countries don't want to be put in a position where they have to choose, right? They proverbial, they want their cake and they want to eat it too. They want to be able to take in resources that China is providing and still maintain strong relationships with Washington. But in the heightened sense, in the heightened state of competition, that's not been that easy because powers like the United States have been pushing back against its partners to make sure that their alignment is, to Washington and not to Beijing. And so that's tough. But I think it's important to note this sort of competition between major powers is not new to the hemisphere. And so Latin American countries have long managed relationships with multiple partners. And again, most prefer the flexibility to be able to align with as many partners that, sort of provides, the requisite, resources and broader geopolitical support needed. But the United States is finding its position where it's increasingly making that pernicious. It is us versus them. And so while the United States is legitimate to look at China as a serious competitor, it's displacing the United States in areas like strategic mining, security assistance, in sort of China's new GSI and how they're leveraging security at very local levels and sort of expanding the aperture to include domestic security. Other really vital economic lifelines around natural resources, beyond the strategic mining. I think the United States now has to see that through a lens in which they do, and are justifying the need to put pressure on countries to not go in that direction for the long-term strategic concerns. I think those are the things that the United States needs to continue to do and court the region in a way that inspires them to align with the United States rather than forcing them. I think forcing them could be, one sort of disingenuous and more importantly, and probably more impactfully, not enduring and long term. And the United States needs to court its partners in an enduring, long term strategic way.
Do you think that the great power competition happening in Latin America is creating an environment where illicit markets can expand, given that the focus is not in strengthening institutions or in strengthening sustained or strategic visions for government locally, but rather in momentary opportunities?
Yes, definitely. That's an incredibly important question because fundamentally, if you're not focused on the deepening of democratic institutions, and instead you're focused on outcompeting, that I think creates space for a diminishing rule of law that could then give way to greater patronage, corruption, illicit opportunities for illicit organizations to operate in the shadows because there's a deficit in the ability to enforce rule of law. And so I think it absolutely could deteriorate to a point where, again, these countries are struggling to maintain their own internal security because they've been pillaged by the great powers. So I think that's a legitimate concern. I'm not sure if I've seen a lot of evidence to support that it's trending in that way, but I can certainly see how strengthened institutions can be undermined.
Thank you. And as we move to the issue of illicit finance, regional financial intelligence units are reporting a growing number of cases tied to Chinese-linked money laundering typologies, including trade-based laundering and underground banking networks throughout the region. How should policymakers interpret these patterns? And what tools and reforms would be most useful in improving regional financial transparency?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And our institute has done some incredible work on that. Uh, Leland Lazarus, who's authored and co-authored work at the institute on Chinese involvement in illicit trafficking flows, is really quite incredible and has been impactful for the policy community. And so I definitely recommend for viewers to sort of parse through our website and look at some of the work that we've done on the Chinese threat finance space. And so with that, again, China has been probably, one of the key proliferators of threat finance, the ability to, whether it's trade-based money laundering, even in the United States, by the way, not just in the hemisphere, but China has a sort of command in certain parts of the United States around money laundering. And so money laundering and how we frame it around threat finance and cartels and illicit trafficking organizations is still somewhat conceptually fuzzy. But I think it's important to at least delineate and clearly state that fundamentally China and Chinese networks play an incredibly important role in the threat finance space in Latin America. And so you start to think about what tools should the United States do to respond. I mean, stronger financial intelligence units, I think, would help with the analytical and investigative capacity, not just of the United States, but partner nations across the hemisphere that are also looking to tackle this. I think improving transparency and trade and reducing corruption, these may seem like pipe dreams, but these are also really important to do in order to, be able to expose, not just Chinese, but other sort of threat finance mechanisms. There's certainly a demand for greater regional and international cooperation to track criminal networks that not just operate domestically, but across the globe. This is not exclusively a Western Hemisphere issue too. And these are global networks in the financial sector. So I think that would also be incredibly valuable.
As we move on to technology, it's become another major area of influence. As we've seen in Latin America, Chinese companies, whether in telecommunications, surveillance systems, cloud services, or broader digital infrastructure, have played a growing role across the hemisphere. Now, how have these technologies reshaped the cybersecurity risk profile of Latin American and Caribbean governments? And given China's increased presence, what realistic options does the US have to mitigate risks and support partners?
So let's unpack it a little bit. It's a great question because I think that a question tips on something that's really important, and that is the rapid sort of expansion of technology in the hemisphere and the central role that Chinese companies have played in that. Companies like Huawei and ZTE have rapidly expanded their 5G telecommunication networks. We're seeing data centers and smart cities popping up all over the place that are connected to and with Chinese technology companies. And so I think that's been a challenge. And the reality is that these companies are offering affordable, high quality infrastructure at a fraction of the price. I remember one year Huawei took like a 30% hit on its sort of revenue. In other words, they went into a deficit 30% trying to proliferate technologies in the hemisphere. And it illustrated something really important. And that is, it's not purely about profit in the hemisphere, that it's being subsidized by the Chinese state as a means of getting, some degree of control over the technology market. And I think the Chinese have done that really well. The Chinese proliferate just a few fundamental, areas of tech, and that's one sort of digital infrastructure, routers, computing systems. I mean, they're heavy in the digital infrastructure, and this is where they can outcompete Western companies because they can do it cheap. That's one. Two, sort of fiber optic cables and sort of 5G, these bigger, bigger systems that they've been able to proliferate across the region. And then three, the role they're playing in emerging technology like quantum and AI. I think that's also really fundamentally important. And then there's a broader sort of digital diplomacy effort that the Chinese have undertaken. This is something that spun out of the China's Belt and Road Initiative, something framed as the digital Silk Road, where China was pursuing this deeply interconnected, digital environment that was built fundamentally on Chinese technology. And so, and that's inclusive of smart cities and surveillance technology and just sort of all of these technologies that they've been able to proliferate quickly, and certainly far more competitively than Western companies. So that's a challenge for us. And so Chinese cyber activities in the region are really about things like intel collection, so espionage and then IP theft and things like that. I mean, that's what they've been able to leverage their cyber capacity. But all of that's built on digital, China's digital footprint. So the question is, how do we compete? And this is I'll break out the crystal ball because we've not really found a good answer for how we compete. It's hard to pursue or commit American technology businesses or Western technology businesses to go in and compete. The U.S. looks for return on investment, like Western investors look for return on investment 1 to 3 years. It seems like Chinese state-owned enterprises are okay with a 10-year investment plan where this concept of patient capital that floats around, that they don't need a return on investment as quickly as Western. So Western investors, so they're allowed to make take these kinds of losses in markets that they have long-term strategic interest in. And so the United States has to compete against that. I think the United States is doing, certainly over the last few administrations, and this one included, some really unique things about how we help support and invest in American businesses, how we align American businesses more with American foreign policy interests and national security interests, and then back it with investment, right? So you've seen a variety of different types of investment structures spin out of the United States to be able to incentivize financially companies that are going to go in and compete against Chinese technology companies, for example. I think that's important to again competing with China on a sort of 1-to-1 in terms of technology. I think the other element of that is the United States needs to continue to talk about how dangerously and strategically vulnerable Chinese technology is for countries in the hemisphere. I mean, data centers that flow through China are probably not in the interest of countries in the Americas to allow their data to be pillaged. I think facial recognition technologies, could, be misused by authoritarian leaning leaders. And so I think the United States needs to continue to talk about, technology adoption at speed in a more cautious and risk-averse way to not give sort of the keys to the castle to the Chinese as they continue to pursue.
So, thinking about this long-term strategy, let's bring academia into the picture. Across the region, universities are deepening engagement with Chinese institutions, including partnerships associated with the Confucius Institute, joint research, academic exchanges, other types of engagement. What role can academia play in helping policymakers interpret these engagements and understand this broader as the implications that surface for the region in security.
You think about Confucius Institutes, although they're funded by, historically by Haban, they eventually become sort of autonomous, institutes throughout the region, no longer funded by Haban, but have now, sort of codified a Chinese footprint in universities. So there's Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. Classrooms start to operate the secondary level. This is about a few things. One, this is about sort of the Chinese promoting China's view of the world, censoring things that are not in the interests of sort of China's brand and narrative. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to walk into a Confucius Institute and have someone talk objectively about Tiananmen Square, right? Or Taiwan's pursuit, in sustained pursuit of democratic governance, and so the Chinese have been able to use these as mechanisms of information as an instrument of its national power. In addition to that, it's also been a means of rallying overseas ethnic Chinese around the Chinese message. And so I always found it interesting that in some Confucius institutes, they're teaching Mandarin to overseas ethnic Chinese, so that those overseas ethnic Chinese become extensions of China and more aligned with Chinese foreign policy interests, and now speak Mandarin so they can continue to carry the message forward in the countries that they now reside in and have deeper connective tissue. And so these Confucius institutes are really important. The U.S. used to have something called binational centers for Latin America. And binational centers for Latin America, which were born decades ago, was along the same spirit: promote sort of Western values, promote American culture, promote English as a dominant global language for trade. And so the U.S. is now in the process of resurrecting them. I think they've changed the name to America Centers, and they're now starting to pop those back up. I had an opportunity to see one recently in Panama. Beyond that, there's still so many other types of civil society, non-governmental organizations that are and should be deployed to support America's interests here. You said universities. Well, I happen to be at a university, so I can talk long about the role universities play. And I think as being brokers of objective knowledge and truth. Think about my university, Florida International University, and the number of students from Latin America and the Caribbean that are on campus any given semester. That's really powerful connective tissue. And many times those students will go home and they become, the next head of state, the next, CEO of a major multinational, business functioning out of Santiago, Chile, whatever that is. I think those are important mechanisms to continue to build, connective tissue between the United States and the region. So on one end, it's developing workforce. It's helping, build, the talent pool of Latin American, talent that's ascending into, some of the most, cutting edge positions, whether that's in tech or in mining or in business. I think that's one. I think two is, again, what we do in terms of production of knowledge. So at the Institute for Public Policy that I'm privileged to direct at the university, we do a lot of research in support of the U.S. government on issues of consequence to Latin America and the Caribbean, whether that's looking at the China, sort of China's activities in the region, or looking at transnational organized crime, migration flows, governance issues. We try to take and we do take a academic rigorous approach to how we do discovery on some of these issues, and we put that out there in the hopes that it helps influence decision making and thought leadership in the Americas. So we play a workforce development role, we play a thought leadership role, and then lastly we play a convening role. So in the issue of security, for example, and we're privileged to partner with the Atlantic Council on this, so I'm going to pitch it in the hopes it makes the editorial cut. But every year we host the Hemispheric Security Conference, which is the premier dialogue on issues of security importance to the Western Hemisphere. It's comprised of not just the U.S. government, but representatives from countries all across the Americas. And it happens in Miami. So this year it'll be April 28th and 29th. Don't cut that. And so we welcome everybody to Miami, FIU, Atlantic Council, Taida Foundation. And so convening power, bringing people together to have these conversations and understand varying perspectives, I think is really important too. And it's a role that universities can play as a neutral, objective.
Thank you for that very thoughtful answer, Brian. As we look ahead towards the next decade, Latin America is navigating a more multipolar environment with more options in partners, financing, and development. As a final question for this series, what factor do you think will matter most in determining whether countries can engage major powers like the US and China without undermining their own institutions?
Countries need to secure their homeland first, right? I mean, I think countries need to, and we're seeing this across the region right now with declarations of states of emergency and sort of domestic security and governance challenges. And some of that is, pushed by external transnational pressures. And so to maximize the broader global and multipolar landscape, countries need a bit more clarity at home in terms of, who they are and where they're going and just, I think a reinforcing of not just democracy, but the strength that democratic institutions provide in sort of even in sort of chaos, right? Democracy is not clean. It's actually quite chaotic in many times, but there's a beauty in the chaos because it ends up, again, allowing sort of the voice of the people to emerge. And I think, process becomes really fundamental. If not, external powers can co-opt those divisions. External powers can manipulate those divisions, and that's probably at a detriment to the national interest of partners in the region. So I'd love to see the region continue to work towards greater stability in the political landscape. Is I think emerging for them to continue to leverage to build their respective, national trajectory. So I would say again, institutions are fundamental, and I probably believe I'm an institutionalist to some degree, where I think institutions are fundamental in allowing countries to then capitalize on the changing geopolitical landscape, the changing technological landscape. I mean, just capitalize on all the changes in the spirit of the will of the people.
Brian, thank you for this thoughtful and nuanced analysis. Your insights help illuminate how the region can navigate this moment of strategic competition with clarity and agency.
So, and thank you to the audience for joining us as we unpack the security landscape of Latin America.
Miguel, Stephanie, thank you so much. And of course, to all those attending, appreciate the opportunity to do this with you. This is fun. Thank you.
This has been the Experts of the Americas. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to receive our content and follow us at theatlanticcouncil.org. See you next time.